Test, test, test. 1, 2, 3.
Good. Good evening, everyone. We're going to let a few more folks settle in here, but I would say that we're probably going to get going in about 3 minutes or so. All righty. Good evening, everybody. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome, Henry. Welcome, Chapistas. If you don't know a Chapista, you have to buy the book. Elm Street Books is right over here. By the time you're done, you'll know what a Chapista is. I am so excited about this event. My name is Chris Dawson. I'm with People Friendly Stanford. We are very proud to partner with the Ferguson Library on this event to bring a terrific young thinker here in Henry Grabar. If I may say, the Ferguson is the single greatest public resource in Stanford. I can't say enough about how hard the staff works on events like this one. So thank you so much. Now, People Friendly Stanford is a local, all-volunteer community advocacy group focused on creating walkable, bikeable, runnable neighborhoods, reducing car dependency, improving transit, and supporting housing abundance. Our general meetings are open to the public. The next meeting is Monday, September 16th at 7 p.m. If you sign up in our registration list in the front, we will put you on our MailChimp list. And there's a QR code right on the front of that table where Henry's sitting, where you could, that'll take you right to our MailChimp page. Let me cover a few housekeeping items. First is phones on silent mode, please. There will be a Q&A immediately following Henry's talk. So if you could, please keep your questions brief so we can allow as many questions as possible. At the conclusion of the Q&A, books will be available for purchase and signing. Thank you, Elm Street Books, for bringing all the books today. Immediately following the event, everyone here in this room is invited to the Stanford Pro Homes Meetup that Desegregate Connecticut and People Friendly Stanford will co-host at Town Parlor at 112 Bedford Street, which is a 1-minute walk from here. Henry has graciously said he will swing by for a drink. In order to get there, it's left out of the building, left on Bedford, and Town Parlor is right on your left. Now, there are just simply way too many special guests here to do a shout out by name. Instead, let me thank people by group. So thank you to the members of the mayor's office who are here. Thank you to the Land Use Bureau, the Transportation, Traffic, and Parking Department, the Zoning Board, the Planning Board, the Board of Reps, the Board of Finance, the Connecticut State Senate, the Connecticut State House, and community advocates from all across the region. Now, let me share a little bit about Henry. He has local roots. He grew up on Broome Street in Lower Manhattan. Now, you may know that Broome Street is one of the Holland Tunnel on-ramps. About his childhood experience on Broome Street, Henry said, quote, "It's a horrendous traffic jam full of drivers blocking the box and engaging in otherwise barbarian behavior. I think encountering that every afternoon gave me a certain perspective about car culture and the way people behave in their automobiles in the challenges of adapting cities to the automobile." Henry went on to college locally, graduating from Yale with a degree in American Studies and French. By the way, if you have already read his book, you know that it is peppered with laugh-out-loud local stories from New York City and Connecticut. Since 2016, Henry has been a staff writer at Slate, where he writes the Metropolis column, which focuses on housing, transportation, and the environment. His work has also been published in Architect, The Atlantic, Guardian, Harper's, New York Times, The Wall Street Journal, and he's produced podcasts for The Decoder Ring, 99% Invisible, and What Next? He was the editor of the Future of Transportation anthology and is, of course, the author of Paved Paradise, How Parking Explains the World, which was named the best book of the year by The New Yorker and The New Republic. He's taught journalism to students from the Harvard Graduate School of Design, the University of Southern California, and Sarah Lawrence, and he is a 2024 Loeb Fellow at the Harvard Graduate School of Design. Now, parking's trade-offs are immense. What we mandate, or I should say, when we mandate parking based on flawed assumptions or fail to market price parking, we sacrifice housing, pedestrian safety, tax dollars, a clean environment, and our economic prosperity. This lecture will surprise you about how parking literally impacts everything. Now, help me in giving a big Stanford welcome to Henry Grabar.
Thank you very much for that introduction, Chris. I'm going to stand over here so I'm not blinded by the projector. Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. Usually when you see this many people turn out to talk about parking, it means someone's trying to build affordable housing in the neighborhood, which I'm not. Don't worry. Let your guard down. I'm just here to talk to you about the search for parking and how it has impacted our urban landscape, society, and everything else, as Chris was saying. Donald Shoup, who is the Pope of parking studies, likes to say that thinking about parking takes place in the reptilian cortex of the brain, which is the part of the brain said to govern territoriality, aggression, and ritual display. And now I think science has moved on from this concept of the reptilian cortex, but it holds true for parking. There's no doubt about it. We are fiercely attached to our parking spaces. I'm coming to you today from Boston. Now, Boston is a city where there is a legitimate parking shortage in some places. And when it snows, we get a nice illustration of this because people will save the parking spaces that they've shoveled out with any array of objects. Now, this particular illustration comes from Chicago, where I used to live, but the practice is pretty much the same. And you get little, toy basketball hoops and nativity scenes and odd pieces of equipment from the garage, or I guess not the garage, given the clientele here. Point being that I've always imagined when I see these objects inside the parking space that you would be beaten with the object in question if you were to take that parking space. So it's a kind of a threat. And it's hard to imagine another area in which the city government is explicitly endorsing vigilante justice as a practice, but that's basically what we have going on with parking policy in some parts of the Northeast and the Midwest. And in fact, in Boston, where I live now, when they tried to limit this practice to just 48 hours after a snowfall, a city council person said that this speaks to the basic right of what it means to be an American. Because like the pioneers, residents have a right to stake their claims. So that's where we're at with parking in Boston, where I'm coming from. And at the same time, there's some bad stuff going on in Boston, population-wise. 1 in 4 young people plan to leave. The population is declining. All bad news. And why is this happening? Because housing has become prohibitively expensive. And so what we're experiencing in Massachusetts, as we are in New York City and Washington and California and many other parts of the country, is that the population is declining in spite of the fact that wages are higher than they are in other states. And so for the first time in American history, people are moving away from the parts of the country where you can make the most money and have the most opportunity. And that's because housing has become so expensive that it outweighs those higher wages in people's economic considerations. That's very unfortunate, and one of the reasons for that is that Boston is building more parking spaces than it is homes, because Boston continues to require that every single apartment or home built in the city, and that's to say nothing of the suburbs, requires a parking space or 2, or sometimes 3 or 4, to come with it. And this is an enormous expense in addition to a large amount of space in the city being dedicated to parking instead of housing. Now, what's interesting about this is that when a developer in Boston makes the decision not to build housing near a train station because the neighbors require a bunch of parking, that household that would have lived in that apartment building doesn't disappear. Where do they go? They place like this, which is about 30 miles outside of Boston. They move into a house like this, which has the effect of eating up that beautiful New England forest that we all know and love. And what's great about Google Street View is that I was able to find this development, and then you can just scroll back in time and see that it really was a beautiful piece of forest before it was turned into a subdivision. And so this is one of the ways in which this concern about the parking shortage freezes our urban geography and pushes development out into the sprawl, where it creates even more traffic and even more car ownership than it would if it were in the city. And by the way, in Boston's case, we're lucky if people move out to this plot of land, because most of them are actually moving to Arizona or Texas. So how do we get to this point where parking is occupying such a important place in the way we think about cities? When I started researching my book, I was surprised to go back to discussions about the mid-century American city and find that at the end of World War II, as the time came to focus on rebuilding America's cities, people were absolutely preoccupied with the question of where to park these cars, to the extent that you perhaps can't see exactly what's happening in this cartoon which is from the Los Angeles Times in 1945. But this hulking King Kong-like figure portrayed over downtown Los Angeles is labeled the downtown parking problem. And that was the perception of how important parking was to the survival of the city. That if the city did not provide parking, that it would lose in competition to the suburbs, and that the parking was in fact the primary way that the city was going to retain its primacy in the metropolitan environment. So we all know how that went. But first, let me just say, at this time, this is from 1953, parking was a really vibrant field of study. Like, lots and lots of research was being produced trying to figure out how to get the parking situation exactly right. Planners understood, and had since the 20s, and even earlier, that parking was a really key feature in managing the urban environment. And I think that some of this science has been lost. This particular Highway Research Board bibliography has more than 1,000 references inside it, which just goes to show how hard city planners were thinking about getting this right. And in fact, there was even a children's game, Park and Shop. Doesn't sound like my idea of fun, and I think there's a reason why this one hasn't had the staying power of Monopoly. But you can play parking yourself in this game, which takes place in Allentown, Pennsylvania. Now, unfortunately, this body of research was lost to time, and what we ended up with instead was a threefold approach to providing parking. What did we do? We bulldozed most of our city cores to create publicly operated municipal garages. We embarked on massive urban renewal projects to clear away developments in cities that were deemed to have an urban form that was considered obsolete. And then, of course, we made a seismic change to the building code in almost every city and suburb in the United States, which was to require that every single use, whether it was an apartment building, bowling alley, a tennis court, grocery store, you name it, have a certain number of parking spaces that came with that use. And that at first seemed like a fairly piecemeal change, given that most of the city was already existing. But as time went on, this would prove to have a determinative effect on the way things looked. And you can see here a little sketch of the evolution of Denver as they finally found a way to provide enough parking in the heart of the city. And they destroyed the city in the process. Now, lest you think this cartoon represents artistic license, here's a little satellite before and after. And if you look very carefully at the image on the left, you can see this kind of bell tower nestled at the heart of what would have, I'm sure, become, I think, a thriving post-industrial arts district or something like that, but is instead been bulldozed for these urban renewal plots, which in time, of course, became giant parking lots. And here's what that looked like on the ground. Now, of course, we don't need to go all the way to Denver to find an example of a policy like this taking effect. This is Hartford. Hartford, Connecticut in 1957 had 170,000 people and only 15,000 parking spots between them. So obviously a crisis. What did we do? We tripled the number of parking spots in Hartford, and yet this did not manage to create a more vibrant, more prosperous city. In fact, perhaps the opposite could be said. And Hartford's population has declined as the city has dedicated more and more of its downtown to surface parking lots, which you can see outlined in red on this image to the right. Now, what's interesting is this is starting to change. I'm going to talk about Hartford in a little bit, but here in Stamford, there is a discussion underway right now about whether it makes sense for the city to require every single land use to come with its own fixed number of parking spaces. So this is an article from the paper just, a few days ago. You can see that all forces are aligning. We're all geared up about enthusiasm about parking reform. And the theme here is that it's hard to provide multi-bedroom apartments downtown because Stamford requires so many parking spaces with every bedroom. And so the solution may lie in changing the city's parking rules. Now, it all sounds great on the surface, right? When you think about this zoning change, I think one of the ways that I think about it is that cities made a decision that they were going to turn over the responsibility of providing parking to the private sector. And so instead of having to destroy their downtowns and build those parking lots themselves, as we saw in the case of Denver, they would ask developers to do it themselves. And the private sector would bear the cost of providing all this parking. Problem solved, right? The problem is parking takes up a lot of space. The estimates are it's about 300 square feet per parking space when you include getting in and getting out. And it also costs a lot of money to build. And it's fun that I get to talk about this topic in Stanford because Stanford actually has, as far as I can tell, one of the most egregious examples of spending on a public garage. Now, I don't think it's a city-owned garage because it's adjacent to the Metro North. Somebody correct me if I'm wrong. But this garage cost $82 million for 928 spots. And I did a little back of the envelope math, and that's almost $90,000 for every parking space. So, yeah. Well, can you wait until the end unless it's about this garage? Sorry. And one of the results of this, right, is that instead of every building coming with its little ready-made parking lot included, we actually ended up just cutting out a whole swath of the urban environment where providing this parking didn't make sense. It didn't pencil out either because parking required too much space or because it cost too much money to build. And I like to think of this in a term that the developer Peyton Chung introduced to me as the valley of the high parking requirements, which is what you see at left here, right? So it's still possible to do low-density sprawl with the parking lot taking up more room than the store or the single-family home with its 3-car garage. And it's still possible to build a high-rent office building, a luxury condo with a big, expensive garage at the base of the building. But what's not possible is everything that comes in between. So that's row houses, triple-deckers, bungalow courts, courtyard apartments. All the vernacular that once made up the backbone of the American city has become impossible to build because of the parking requirement. And so the result of this is that we've turned our urban environment from something that once looked like this into something that looks like that. And we've turned our commercial landscapes from something that looks like this into something that looks more like that. Now, parking is currently undergoing a renaissance, I'm pleased to say, and it's thanks entirely to the work of Donald Shoup, who I introduced at the beginning of this talk as the Pope of parking studies. But Don has done more than anybody to resurrect interest in this topic as an important determinant of the urban environment. And he wrote a big and surprisingly entertaining book called The High Cost of Free Parking, which is about 800 pages, and it's actually really funny. And it's a great book to pick up if you're interested in more of this topic. Now, the good news is that parking reform is pretty popular. People really like this idea that people should be able to decide how much parking comes with every use. I talked to a developer who once said he's got a pitch for this in liberal towns and in conservative towns. And in liberal towns, he comes in and he says, don't you see you're impeding the creation of affordable housing, and you're subsidizing car ownership and fossil fuels, and you're destroying your walkable environment, and you're bulldozing nature to build all these parking lots. And then he goes to a conservative town and he says, you mean to tell me that the government is going to tell me what to do with my property? And they're going to tell me something so arcane as how many parking spots to provide? And he's found this is pretty successful. And that's one of the reasons, well, I should say also, the other reason that this is taking off is because there's this interest in street space, right? And you can see some of this, of course, in Stanford, where you have restaurants and cafes that have set up their seating in the curb lane. But that's only the tip of the iceberg in terms of demand for public space and thinking about how all this land that has been unthinkingly dedicated to storing parked cars might be used for something else. And so we're beginning to see renewed interest in what might take shape in that curb lane. This is an artist's rendering of me speaking to you tonight. He says, take away a few more parking spaces. So I'm going to introduce you to the 3 circles of parking reform. And hopefully this talk will not overlap too much with the book because I'm kind of starting, this is like Parking Reform 201, whereas the book is kind of like 101. So we're going to dive right into stuff that's happening now. Because in the last year since the book came out, I've been talking around the country to audiences, speaking to city councils, et cetera, and getting an even better sense of what kind of reform is happening. And it's actually happening at a pretty rapid clip. And there's three ways that this is happening. We're building less parking, we're using the excess parking that we have, and we're changing people's behavior through parking policy. I'm going to introduce you to some of those concepts. So let's start with building less. We know that there is more than enough parking at almost every development site and in almost every city. And for a while, we didn't have any information about this. But one of the things that's changed over the last decade, when I talk about this parking renaissance, is we're finally counting, right? And it makes sense because this stuff takes up, 14, 15% of the land in big cities like Los Angeles, where real estate is incredibly valuable, and no one has ever thought to say, how many parking spaces are there, right? And so that's finally happening now. And once you have that information, you begin to realize that there's actually a ton of parking in the urban environment. And so we don't need to require it with every single land use. And the cycle that happened, starting with the imposition of parking requirements in the middle of the 20th century, in which the urban vernacular evolved from this to that, to this to that, is beginning to reverse itself. And you can see that this corresponds, this urban form, which you think of as being a result of taste or aesthetic preference or perhaps the commercial demands of a property, is actually all about parking. It's the parking requirement that determines the urban form. And when we think about the conventional Main Street with a business on the ground floor and an office or a residence on top, that's what we've made impossible to build. And it's what we're beginning to see revived today as these laws are reversed. So here we have an image of the United States with all of the cities and towns that have, across the entire city, gotten rid of this zoning requirement for parking and decided we're going to let the market decide how much parking to provide, and we're going to see what happens. And this map, by the way, comes from the Parking Reform Network, and if you are interested in this topic, you should both buy Donald Shoup's book and also join the Parking Reform Network, which is full of like-minded thinkers. So now what happens? And I think when I started this book, I was thinking, well, okay, maybe the laws did encourage us to provide more parking, but at the same time, we're a nation of drivers. So maybe it's just preference manifesting itself in the urban environment. Well, now we have some evidence, and we can say, in fact, that the laws did require lots more parking than would otherwise have been built. Here's an example from Seattle. Seattle reduced their parking requirements in fast-growing neighborhoods. Developers took advantage of this, and over a 5-year period from 2012 to 2017, they built 17,000 fewer parking spaces in their buildings than would have been required under the old laws. Now, this doesn't just mean more housing and less parking, more homes for people and fewer homes for cars, but it also amounts to an enormous savings in the amount of money that was spent on parking. These 17,000 parking spaces at the going rate of a Seattle garage would cost $500 million to build. So this is $500 million saved in unused parking in one city over 5 years. Now, this doesn't necessarily immediately translate to lower housing costs, but it does lower the cost of doing business as a developer, which lures in more competition to the market, and at the end of the day, we hope means that housing costs go down. Minneapolis is seeing something similar happen. They have also gotten rid of their requirements for parking, and they have seen fewer parking spaces being built, which you see in this chart on the left. And also, this mirrors what's happening nationally. These graphs come from the Wall Street Journal, and they show the average number of parking spaces going down. This is the market adjusting to what people want. For 40, 60, 70 years, there's only been one thing on the menu if you're looking at a new apartment. And it's an apartment or a house that comes with 2 or 3 parking spaces. You have to pay for it whether you want it or not. And I'm not saying that most people don't want it. I think most people do want it. Most of you probably own cars. Most of you probably have parking spaces. But there are some people for whom they would rather spend that money on housing and sort out the parking later. And that is the type of housing supply that we're beginning to see make its way into the market for the first time in 100 years. So these show, let's see, this is on the upper left, Austin, Texas, brand new building, no parking. Miami, brand new building, no parking. This is Phoenix, or well, Tempe, Arizona, which is a suburb of Phoenix, brand new building, no parking. And this one on the bottom right is Minneapolis, brand new building, no parking. So clearly there is an appetite for this type of development, and we're beginning to see new types of housing, and that in turn means new types of people that can live in these neighborhoods that were previously off limits. And so that's a very exciting thing that's happening. And yes, it may not be for you, but maybe this is something, this here on the bottom right, is an option for some aging homeowner in a single-family home neighborhood who can now downsize and stay in the neighborhood that they've lived in for 30 years. Now, the other people who are really taking advantage of this change are commercial developers. We're seeing lots of new businesses start where they would once have been impeded by the obligation to provide parking. This comes from Fayetteville, Arkansas. And you'll notice that when I'm talking about these cities, I'm not talking about San Francisco and Boston. I'm talking about Austin, Texas. I'm talking about Phoenix. I'm talking about Fayetteville, Arkansas, right? This is the Sun Belt. This is places where people drive all the time to go everywhere. And yet, there's lots of new housing being built without parking. The world is not ending. In fact, lots of things are beginning, like this rooftop bar here in Fayetteville, made possible because the city no longer requires downtown businesses to have their own parking. So it becomes a lot easier to start a business. And then, of course, Hartford, Connecticut, which I picked on them earlier for destroying their downtown, but the good news is that Hartford is now one of the national pioneers in reforming their zoning to build less parking. This is a project from Hartford, 60 units, 18 spaces, and it's part of the revitalization of the downtown there. So that's pretty exciting. Now, second part of parking reform, the three circles of parking reform, and I've organized them by how angry they make people. So first step is building less parking. Nobody really notices, to be honest, because they still have their parking space, so what does it matter if the neighbors don't have theirs? But once you come to making the most of spare parking, the tension starts to build, just a little bit. So let's look at Stanford, right? Like, you guys have tons of spare parking capacity in your garages. And we were just talking about where people park when they come to the library, and the concern that with Burlington closing, the library might lose a parking asset. But I want to focus on that because I think that's a good example, actually, of the sort of symbiosis of people sharing parking and taking advantage of spare parking that exists at other sites. Here's an example from downtown Los Angeles, another famously walkable, transit-oriented city. So Los Angeles has actually a beautiful core of downtown commercial buildings. They date from the early 20th century, and for most of the second half of the 20th century, they were completely abandoned. They were completely empty, and that's because their original purpose as office buildings had sort of gone out of fashion, and they weren't really equipped for that. And where they would have been renovated into residences had they been in New York, Philadelphia, or Chicago, that couldn't happen in Los Angeles because the city required so much parking. They required 2 spaces with every new apartment. And imagine this beautiful blue building. If you were to provide 2 spaces with every apartment in there, you'd have to turn the first 16 floors of the thing into parking. Fortunately, in 2000, they stopped requiring this. And what they saw was a massive boom in the number of conversions of these historic structures, which up to this point, you were unable to do anything with because they required so much parking. Now, I heard an architect explain this to me by saying it's sort of like every building has a parking padlock around it. These historic structures, and you can find no other use just because there's so much parking required to bring them up to code. Now, this is also happening on a small scale in Los Angeles because California has stopped requiring parking with every new accessory dwelling unit, which means that if you want to turn your garage into a small apartment or an Airbnb or an in-law unit, a granny flat, right, for some local student or your kid who's come home from college and needs a place to live, you can do that without providing additional parking spots. Now, it turns out that this obligation to provide additional parking spots with every ADU was stopping construction of ADUs entirely. The city wasn't building any of them. The whole state wasn't building any of them. But when they said you don't need to build the parking, ADU construction boomed. These units now make up 1 in 4 new units in the entire city of Los Angeles. So you're seeing a massive boom, again, in the type of housing that brings a diversity of housing to these neighborhoods that have previously been characterized solely by single-family homes. On this subject of spare parking, we should also mention the fact that we have a lot of new technology that's sort of bringing parking online. And in fact, when I talked to the founder of Spot Hero, which is this app you see here, which helps you find a parking space before you arrive at the location instead of driving around in circles, as much fun as that is, he told me that when he started this, he thought that there wasn't enough parking. And what he learned was, and this was in Chicago, what he learned was there actually is enough parking, it's just we don't know where it is, right? And often it's you're going to the library, but you don't realize that you have to park in the Burlington parking lot, right? And so Spot Hero brings this type of parking supply online and allows us to share parking. Then, of course, there is the demand for curbside parking, which I mentioned earlier. You have some of this in Stanford. That's Stanford at top. You can kind of date that photo by the quality of the infrastructure. But you also have examples from Brooklyn and on the right, Philadelphia. And in fact, they have these on every corner in Philly now. It's kind of crazy. And then we come to behavior change, right? And this is like the third circle of parking reform where people really start to get upset, but I think it's going to be okay. Because it turns out that parking is actually a key determinant of the way people get around. No surprise, right? We've talked about its effect on housing costs, on the type of stuff that gets built, on architecture, on the reuse of historic structures. But of course, parking is intimately connected to transportation. What we see is that the more parking you provide, the more cars people own, and the more they drive, right? So this is a very interesting study from San Francisco of winners of the affordable housing lottery. And what they found was that irrespective of access to transit or income, the more parking spaces that were provided in a project, the more likely the people who moved into those projects were to own cars. And this should have some interesting lessons for those of you who are thinking about traffic, right? I think this is one of our big concerns when we think about growth. We think about new neighbors arriving and everybody worries that there's going to be more traffic. Well, the lesson here is the more parking you provide, the more traffic there's going to be because the more people who move in there are going to own cars. And I heard this from a city staffer in Chicago who said, if your primary concern is traffic and your primary request is parking, you have to understand that those two things are at cross purposes. Now, we can also see examples of this on a citywide scale. This is a Federal Highway Administration study, lest you think the source is biased. And what it shows is that citywide commute vehicle miles traveled, basically the amount of driving that occurs every day as part of the 9 to 5. This amount of driving in Boston and Cambridge would fall by 10% if we were to change parking policy at offices, right? And this seems like a pretty small thing, right? Just change the way people pay for parking at their offices. And what this shows is that if people who currently park for free at their office, which includes many of us, received instead a small cash bonus for every day they didn't drive to work to compensate them for not using that resource, that you could see citywide VMT in Boston fall by 10%. It's massive. And this holds true, by the way, even in cities that are much more car-oriented. They also did this study for Houston and Los Angeles and found similar results. And so I think parking motivates the way people get around. We also have some proof of this from New England. This is an interesting study. You can't really read it, but just take my word for it. It shows a correlation between the amount of parking spaces built per capita between 1960 and 1980 and the change in mode share towards driving between 1980 and 2000. And so if you're wondering, is parking a predictor of car use or simply a response to it? This study demonstrates that parking is in fact a predictor of car use. And that if you provide parking now, you are baking in driving and traffic and car ownership for decades to come. Now, when we talk about changing behavior, we can reduce the amount of parking, but we also have to find a way to manage it, right? Because we don't want a situation like we talked about at the beginning where I get beaten over the head with somebody's nativity scene because they took their parking spot. So here is an example from Seaside, Florida. Some of you if you're architects, you may know this town. It's sort of flagship development of new urbanism. But for years, the planner, Andres Dwani, told me there was a central flaw in Seaside, and that's that they had dedicated this downtown plaza to parking, and they'd made it a big parking lot. Now, during COVID, there was no traffic there, and they found suddenly that it was this car-free plaza, and everybody loved it so much that they wanted to keep it that way. And now, how were they going to keep it that way? Well, what they did was they started charging for parking. And they charged for parking. What they realized was the demand for this parking was not fixed. It was not, as the codes had long assumed, that every business must come with its fixed quantity of parking, and that is the law handed down from on high. It's not like that at all. In fact, people's demand for parking responds quite, shall I say, quickly to the price that is charged for that parking. And it's not because people stop coming, right? It's because people change the way they get there. In Seaside's case, they found people were biking, walking. People who wanted free parking were parking a little further away and walking from those parking spaces. That had the beneficial effect of introducing more pedestrians into the environment, more customers for local businesses, more traffic on the streets, more healthy activity. And also, they found that people were carpooling, right? I mean, this is a place, this is on the Gulf Coast of Florida, where previously families with teenagers, mom, dad, and 2 teenagers would all drive their own SUVs to come to town. And now they get in one car. And that's because the parking costs money. And because the parking costs money, they've been able to turn their downtown from what you saw before into this. And now it's an open plaza, and kids can play soccer there without being worried about being run over by some giant pickup truck that's looking for a parking spot. Now, this is possible, of course, because of this miracle technology invented 100 years ago. When it was invented, the inventor of the parking meter actually invented it not to sock it to the motorist and raise a bunch of money, but to try and organize the street. And that's how we should think about paying for parking. It's not about raising money. It's about organizing this precious resource that we have, this interface between streets and buildings. Of course, this can also be used for other things. And when we talk about behavior change, we talk about getting people out of their cars, sometimes the parking is actually just taking up the physical space that could be used to foster other modes of transportation. For example, buses get stuck in traffic because this lane was once used for the storage of private vehicles for hours and hours at a time. Now people who ride the bus get a quick trip to work in their own dedicated bus lane. And of course, it's true of pedestrians and cyclists as well. Bike lanes are another way that we can use this curbside space to foster a safer commute, because nobody should die riding a bicycle. And on the right, you see a scene from Hoboken, New Jersey, which has begun to daylight their intersections, removing the parked cars around every crosswalk, so the drivers who are approaching those crosswalks can see if there's a pedestrian, especially a small pedestrian, who's about to cross that street, and they can slow down and turn. And I don't think it's a coincidence that Hoboken hasn't seen somebody killed by a car in 7 years. And then finally, of course, I'd be remiss not to talk about the 2 changes we're seeing in the vehicle fleet. One of them is, of course, the electrification of vehicles, which turns every parking spot into a fueling station. And if we think about the mistakes we made at mid-century, building 3 times as many parking spaces as we needed to accommodate our cars, when every parking space requires the installation of a $2,000 to $15,000 piece of electric infrastructure, that's going to be a very costly mistake to repeat. So it would really behoove us at this moment to try and find a way to share the parking so we don't have to install 3 times as much electrical vehicle infrastructure as we actually need. And then the other exciting thing that's happening right now in transportation is that we have a way of automating enforcement. So we don't rely on people walking around and checking on the windshields. And this means that we can move from a system in which parking enforcement is not very well enforced, but when you get a ticket, it's a big ticket, into a system where people perhaps just pay what they owe, and it's automatically assessed much in the way that you would be assessed for driving with your Easy Pass or something like that, right? Because this shouldn't be about catching people out and finding them and revenue-driven policing and a circle of fines and punishment, right? This is about management, it's about urban management, and we have the technology now to make that happen. And change is possible, right? This is Boulder, Colorado. This blue line represents the rate of people traveling alone in their vehicle to work. And you see that as they made many of the changes that I've discussed here, They stopped requiring parking. They started sharing parking between businesses downtown. They gave free bus passes with that parking revenue to all their downtown employees, and they built a bunch of bike lanes. And that's what they saw. They saw a lot fewer people driving to work. So what we learn is that parking demand is elastic. It's changeable, and you can change it here. Now, of course, there are challenges, right? Not everybody is comfortable with change. In my conversations with people around the country, I have come to see us as engaged in a form of the trolley problem. And many of you may know this problem from a college philosophy class or something like that. But the idea is you, this person here, looking unhappily at this situation that's occurring. The trolley is heading down this track here. And it's not a good track. It's a track of sprawl, traffic, high housing costs, ugly buildings, poisoned earth, and endless concrete waste. That has been the status quo for 75 years. Now, you could pull this switch here and change the track and go over here and unleash affordable housing, senior housing, diverse housing types, walkable neighborhoods, denser development and less sprawl, but it would require a modicum of courage because you would have to end parking minimums and manage the parking supply instead of doing just a one-way ratchet on building more and more parking at all times. Now, as I mentioned, this has produced a vicious cycle, right? The more parking we build, the more people drive. The more people drive, the more parking we need. The more development we build that corresponds to people driving, and so on. And we've effectively made it illegal to build walkable neighborhoods for the past 100 years, so we can't really be surprised by this. Now, this was developed by the team at Cul-de-sac, which is that car-free development in Phoenix that I showed you. But the crack team here at Unpaving Paradise Associates has drawn up their own graphic. And this is the virtuous cycle. So this is what's possible. This could be you in the center. And the cycle is more or less that as you permit this greater density, the limited parking access and the parking management serves as a control on the amount of traffic. In turn, not everybody needs a car to get everywhere because people are living closer to amenities. And that greater density of people supports a greater density of amenities, a greater density of schools, shops, gyms, parks, convenience stores, and so on. Everything is closer together. And so this cycle begins to take shape. So just at the moment when parking actually becomes hard to find, hard to get, and streets start to fill up, things start to get better, and other ways to get around become possible. And then everything becomes possible, right? Because all this space that we've dedicated to parking serves as a kind of a land bank. And we can have cafes in the streets, and we can have stormwater infrastructure instead of asphalt. And we can have safer streets where people drive more slowly. And we can plant trees to shade ourselves to keep these ever hotter summers at bay. And finally, we can have public space, right? Because I think at the end of the day, parking is great, driving is freedom, everybody loves a parking space, but the obligation to drive everywhere is also a tax, especially on poor people, because it costs a lot of money to have to own 3 cars for your household, to be able to get everything, do everything that you need to do, right? And so reversing this isn't just about improving the quality of life and improving our urban environments, but it's also about a kind of economic justice and reducing our need to buy a vehicle and fuel it and insure it and repair it in order to participate in the economic and social life of this country. And I don't think change is about necessarily getting everybody out of their cars. It's about change at the margin. The average household, median household in this country owns 2.2 cars. So we get that down to 2.1, 1.9. If a household with 3 cars can go to 2, and a household with 2 cars can go to 1, then all of a sudden, all this land that we've dedicated to parking could be used for something else. And yes, we might have a city with fewer parking spaces, but what would emerge in its place would be a city so much richer and fuller and fairer that you would not think twice about what had been lost. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Henry. Okay, we're going to open it up to questions, and if they're brief, we'll get a lot more questions in. So Jerry's going to hand out a mic, and Will, just raise your hand. Right in the back, way in the back there. Just press the.
Well, to tell you the truth, I live in Cambridge. So sorry for obfuscating that, but I say it to try and reject what I think of as a New Yorker as this parochial thing that happens in Boston, where they have like 700 different cities and they all pretend they have their own like thing going on. Like, it's all Boston to me. Did you ever beat anybody over the head with to preserve your parking stuff? I think the fact that you owned only one car is probably a testament of what I've been talking about, the determinative effect of parking on vehicle ownership, right?
Is that Monica?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, right. It's a great question. I think there's a couple answers. Obviously, it would be great if the United States would invest in European or Japan or Chinese style mass transit solutions in our cities, right? But unfortunately, the bottom line is nobody's going to use mass transit if parking is easy and driving is easy. It's just not going to happen. And so you often hear this that like, okay, well, we can't restrict the parking supply, reduce the parking supply, build less parking until we have New York style, Paris style, San Francisco style bus service or whatever. But it's actually, I think, the other way around. And that, in fact, no one's going to ride the bus as long as there is a place to park downtown, because driving will always be easier and faster and cheaper. And so I think the order of those things need to be reversed. I agree that there needs to be more investment in mass transit, but I think the way to get more people riding mass transit, which supports in turn the continued provision of that service, is by building greater density and making it harder and more expensive to park. Now, the other thing I want to say is that, of course, many people rely on their cars to make their commutes. We're talking about trips of 12 miles. Most jobs are in the suburbs, not well served by mass transit. That's not changing anytime soon. But actually, the commute only represents about 1 in 6 trips. So most of the trips we make every day are to go to the gym, to go to the doctor's office, to take a kid to school. And those are trips that are often made in the neighborhood. I think the census or the American Community Survey shows that half of all trips in the United States are under 3 miles, which is a distance that could be comfortably made on an electric bike, in a super small car, on foot, if we provided streets that made that safe and easy to do so. So obviously there are changes that need to happen, but I don't think that we should just throw up our hands and say, well, we're not Tokyo, we're not Paris, so it's not going to happen here.
Jerry.
Hi, I think I know how you're going to respond to this, but I'm someone who grew up in the suburbs right outside of Queens, right? So I've got the New York, I've always, my whole life, taken public transportation and driven. I lived in LA for a while, and that was a shocker because you had to get validated parking. You had to pay for parking everywhere. Here in Stamford, I hear what you're saying. It sounds like a chicken or the egg thing. Build the density, and then people won't drive anymore. But unlike some of the other areas I've lived in, this is a much older city and town, and it's unique in a way because we're a city, but we're also a suburb in a lot of ways. So like this other, attendee just described, getting here from Springdale, many of our roads, including the roads I live near, are very narrow. And because of density, like overcrowded homes, frankly, we've got some blight in my neighborhood in the Cove. It's like an obstacle course getting down. You pretty much have to drive, you have to hover over that yellow middle lane. Roads just, people are going to be frustrated and this can't work until you address the road issues. You know, newer parts of the country that I've lived in were built later. So, you know, people could park and ride the roads. And of course, we need the bus service. I don't foresee us trying to put a subway here in Stamford. And some of what you're talking about definitely works downtown. But I'd be happy to take a bus or a shuttle to the train if they were frequent, you know, at the right times. And getting to school the way the districting is here, when I had to take my son to school, when he missed the 6:33 bus for the high school, it was almost an hour round trip because of the drop-off
I'm sorry,
lines.
do you have a question you want to ask right now?
Well, I'd like to ask him what his ideas are about, you know, addressing issues like this. That I think what's happening is, you know, there's
I think
the
he can-
development
he-
isn't
he
keeping
can
the
take it from here.
infrastructure part of it. You know,
Okay.
the infrastructure and addressing that in order to support this, you know, less car usage.
I think the points about
You're talking about changing generations of culture as well.
points about the built environment in Stamford, I think Stamford is not as unusual as you believe. Actually, there's lots and lots of suburbs around the country that have really similar built environments that have older constricted town centers surrounded by leafier single-family areas. I think the answer is some people here are always going to have to drive until we invent some crazy new technology that just jetpacks people to where they're going, right? And so I think the interest in those of you who feel that your trip cannot be accomplished any other way in the car, you should be in favor of getting other people out of their cars and saying, well, how can we get the people who live closer in, the people who live along those transit routes, the people who could bike, how do we build the infrastructure to get them out of their cars and get those discretionary car trips made some other way so that I, the person who lives 20 miles away and has to drive a car, I'm free to do that, right? So I think, you know, just because your personal trip can't be made any other way doesn't mean that the city is beyond that. Yeah, in the back.
Hello. I just have, well, my question is going to be short and simple. For zoning laws, you mentioned earlier, how can we, well, since zoning laws has been used for racist practices across this country since redlighting, how can we implement these ideas without imposing the burden onto communities, especially low-income, predominantly communities of color? And the second thing, to answer her question, right, Connecticut did impose, but they had a free month of transit, and other places around the world, they heavily invest in transit. So that's just one idea that we can encourage people to use their cars fewer.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up the racist history of zoning, because this is something that cannot be overstated.
Thank you.
We think of single-family zoning as being a question of aesthetic taste, and perhaps it is, but its roots are very much in the rejection by the U.S. Supreme Court of explicit racial zoning, of saying this neighborhood is for whites only, and there are no Jews, no blacks, and no Chinese allowed here, right? That is the history of zoning in this country, and it's only when the Supreme Court says that can't happen that people say, okay, well, let's find a way around that. And the way we're going to find around that is by making this a neighborhood where only single-family homes are allowed, and we're going to prohibit the construction of apartment buildings, and by doing that, we're going to make sure that there's no affordable housing here, and that's going to be a pretty good proxy for keeping out these groups that we don't want in this neighborhood. Now, I think zoning is rightly under attack for these racist practices, banning apartment buildings in neighborhoods, et cetera. But I think parking is an important part of this, because there are communities that have liberalized their zoning, whether through state directive or on their own initiative, but retain super high parking requirements. Connecticut, I'm happy to say, has reined in this practice, but in Massachusetts, there's places that if you want to build apartments in the suburbs, you need to provide 4 parking spaces with every apartment. Now, that's effectively a way of saying we don't want any apartments here, and it's become a real problem. So,
We have there's one last question here.
Hello. Hi, my name is Jason. I'm from West Hartford. Lived in Hartford for a long time, so thank you for highlighting Hartford. I'm a sort of a middle millennial, and I wonder if you think there's a generational shift because people in my generation are heavily burdened by student debt. I had over 6 figures of student debt when I left school. We're burdened by incredibly high housing prices, and so I wonder if you think there's a generational component to this shift away from car culture because we can't afford it. I mean, my car insurance went up 30% last year, going up another 20% this year.
I think it's a great point. I think we millennials have graduated into a terrible job market, and now we are trying to buy houses in the point at which I think the ratio of home prices to incomes has never been as high as it is right now. So I think the optimism that I feel is that this country has a really serious housing shortage. You heard Kamala Harris talk about it last night. It was like the first thing she said when she was asked about what she was going to do about the economy. And I think that reflects the fact she recognizes this is not just reshaping our economic geography, as I showed you, this is the case in Massachusetts, but what it means is there's tremendous potential here. You talk about the low-density environment in a place like Stanford that means that maybe you need to drive to buy your gallon of milk. Well, if you were to double the population, hypothetically, you would support many more amenities in the neighborhoods that people live in. And suddenly it wouldn't be necessary to drive quite so far to get the thing you needed. And I think that kind of, I'm not saying Stanford's population is going to double, but I do think there's room for this kind of missing middle density, row houses, triple deckers, et cetera, which in fact are our heritage. As Americans in all these cities, we all have neighborhoods that look like this. And we can bring these back, and in fact, I think we have to, because there's simply not enough apartments for everybody who needs a place to live right now.
Okay, we're bumping up on 7:30. Unless you want to answer one more question.
You want to do one more? Sure.
Yeah, one more.
Yeah, I had a quick question. I was curious your thoughts on some of the more punitive measures or more expensive measures to curtail driving, such as the congestion pricing in Manhattan that the governor killed at the 11th hour.
Oh, boy. Well, as Chris mentioned, I grew up on a Holland Tunnel on-ramp, so I am particularly sensitive to the habit of people driving into New York City from out of town, and I think it's lodged in my lungs somewhere. But I'm gonna pass on that. I'm just gonna say now that we have no congestion pricing and none on the horizon, many of the goals of congestion pricing could be accomplished through better parking policy. And New York City is trying to enact this super complicated thing with big camera tolls everywhere when, in my opinion, they could simply charge that much for parking spaces and the same goals would be accomplished much more easily.
Thank you very much. Big round of applause for Henry. Elm Street Books has books for sale right over here, and Henry will sign books. And then everybody is welcome over at Town Parlor for the Desegregate Connecticut and People Friendly Stanford Pro Homes Meetup. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for all coming, and look forward to seeing you next time.